Hayley, who, when I asked her for her can't live without a home-based technology, she elected to keep at all costs her TV as a great way to escape, switch off, and yeah, just generally relax. So over to you, Hayley.
Thank you very much, Susan. Yes, I am a little bit of a TV junkie whenever I actually do get a chance outside of this beautiful marking season. So thank you very much to Anne and Zoe. I am about to head into looking at H5P stuff for term 1. So that's next on the list to do. So that was a good little intro for me. So I'll just share my screen there for you, which pop that on. Okay, we can see that. Yes, lovely, thank you. Okay, so hi everyone, my name's Hayley Griffin. I actually work with Susan and a few other people in here within the School of Education at the Arts at CQUniversity. I'm actually on the Bundaberg campus. So the intent of my presentation today, I guess, is to give you a little bit of an insight into what I've been doing over the last 6 months, I guess, when we've all been working from home. I guess I will be honest and say that it's sort of prompted through the whole COVID crisis, but now that I have uncovered these approaches to what I'm doing, I'm not sure if I can go back. I need to keep moving forward and see how I can enrich student learning experiences online through these approaches. So my hope today is that you might pick up or borrow or steal some ideas from me, particularly those of you who are teaching online. So being in the School of Education, the main work that I do is with initial teacher education. So these are students who are training to be classroom teachers, particularly in primary settings. Okay, so first of all, we'll start off with some common knowledge about what we know about quality teaching. So many of us are very familiar with that guy, Vygotsky. You know, we have a lot of emphasis, and particularly for us as teachers, we try and model this wherever possible. So we're thinking about social constructivist learning. So providing those rich learning environments where peers engage to promote and support learning. And my dilemma, I guess, is this idea that we are shifting towards more and more online learning through necessity, but also through to, you know, a competitive online market. We have found that for us this year, we had to shift to that quite quickly. And being usually on a campus, earlier on, a few of the other people were mentioning about, I think David was mentioning that he's a little bit animated in how he speaks and how he moves around the classroom. And when you're teaching a 2-hour session online, it's very easy for students to start doing the old wander, or all the cameras go off and you think, I'm just sitting here talking to myself. So for me, a really big striving force was thinking about, okay, well, how can I take my educational technology beyond just being a conduit, beyond just me transferring and funneling information to students? How are they going to actually get learning out of this? So I wanted to think about, okay, how can I avoid a 2-hour unilateral one-way communication and me just sitting there talking the whole time? How can I avoid students being passive and not really engaging as such to build their own learning? So I had to think a little bit creatively about how can I take what I would normally do face-to-face in my classroom, or the elements of that, and how can I take that into my my online tutorials? So that was my main challenge that I came up against. Now, the other things, along with Vygotsky and thinking about those socially constructive experiences where it's all about the environment and peer learning, I'm also mindful of some other work by Tokuhama Espinosa. So her work looks into brain-based learning and thinking about how the emotive experience and that personal experience can affect learning, but also how learning is reliant on memory but consciousness. So sometimes I was noticing that my students are sitting there and they're sort of listening and they're answering questions, but in terms of really being actively engaged and doing work, or being conscious and thinking about and making the connections themselves, I often visualize the little hamsters on the wheels, and I can see them either running, or I can see them sort of, you know, the hamsters slinging around in the bottom of the hamster wheel. So I wanted to think about, okay, how am I going to do something about this? So my solution was to use a little bit of a multi-dimensional approach. So of course at CQU we predominantly teach on Zoom. So what I did was I coupled Zoom with Microsoft Teams. So this was of course only with a class group of up to about 20 students. So I wasn't engaging, you know, over 150 students in my whole course at the same time. It was a nice cohort of students that could work together. So what I did is I actually created PowerPoints that I embedded within Teams. And the beauty of Microsoft Teams, a bit like Google Docs, is that you can actually do real-time co-authoring. So I use that element of real-time co-authoring so that all of the students who are in the Microsoft Teams group who are clicking on that link can be accessing and working on a single document at the same time. So for me, that was a really powerful way of bringing together the group work element. So what I did is I used breakout rooms, and I put them all into breakout rooms, perhaps in groups of 3 or 4, depending on what I was doing. And I supported them to help know where they've got to go and what they've got to click on and find within Microsoft Teams. Then what we did is I gave them a little a project. So ultimately for PowerPoints, I often got them to create a shared resource. So they were working on like a mini research task of something that was unfamiliar to them. So they might have had to do a little bit of research. It could have been a peer teaching approach where they had to use a little, like create their own little slide that they could use to teach someone something else. On occasion, I did some personal scenarios and I gave them a context that they had to respond to, and they could use imagery and text to respond to that and then present it back to the group. And I think the emphasis of what I was really trying to do as well was one of the professional standards that teachers need to demonstrate in order to graduate is their ability to use ICTs effectively. So this was another element that our pre-service teachers often struggle with, is making sure that they have opportunities to learn and engage and make these connections themselves. So it was really about showcasing a work-related resource that they could be using. So they're focusing on researching, they're engaging in paraphrasing, so very much putting ideas into their own words, designing, communicating, those sorts of things. So this is just a little bit of an overview of what I did in terms of PowerPoint. The other embedded strategy I used within Microsoft Teams was OneNote. So again, I used breakout rooms, and what I did, I used this wonderful element of this real-time co-authoring where I created multiple sections for each group. And because one of the units that I was teaching was actually about the focus is on teaching mathematics in primary classrooms. So what I did sometimes is I would put problems within the content so they could work together as a team and develop mathematical language. So what I found is that I would be jumping from room to room. Students would be putting up their hands digitally so that they could request that I would come to their room, and I'd be jumping in and out. And the real powerful thing that I took away from that is that rather than me sitting here talking for 2 hours nonstop to my PowerPoint, is that when I went in and out of the rooms, students were talking and using the language and the dialogue and the meta language themselves, and they were actually actively creating that. It wasn't about me and what I was telling them as it being gospel from my wonderful lecture. They were actually making the connections, and then I could go in and scaffold and support them on an individual and more personalized basis. So within OneNote, we did small group learning stations with multiple tasks. I had some activities included structured tasks, so structured conversations and discussions where I'd provide them with group roles perhaps and give maybe a number of questions where students could go and take on a specific role, and one person might facilitate and watch the time and prompt the discussion and keep it going, while other students had to read out the shared text and the rest of the group members answered questions while another person maybe recorded the information. So it provided everyone with a different role so that they were actively engaged, and we swapped around those roles as well. We did some open-ended tasks in here where there was brainstorming and students could come up with their own ideas as well. So I found that through this experience, students were far more engaged, to the point where rather than me walking away from my tutorials feeling a little bit reluctant and unsure as to whether I actually achieved anything, I actually felt like I could, first of all, I could visually see the learning that was happening. There was connections there, there were representations, there were words, there was language, and most of all, they were talking. And that was just the most wonderful thing, that I could jump in and out of the rooms. You know, mind you, I often would alarm students when, you know, you come up and sneak up behind them in a classroom and all of a sudden they go, oh, I better start talking about what I'm supposed to be talking about. But for the most part of it, students were actually engaged and working on this. And I think particularly in the socially distanced and remote times that we're learning in, this was essential for students to keep that sense of connection, to maintain a safe and supportive learning environment. So we even had some students, so this was with a typical on-campus group, but I even had some students join me who couldn't join their regular on-campus or distance groups, and they found that the experience was quite beneficial as well. So just to give you a little bit of a summary of the I guess I went back and I looked at some of my reflections and considered some of the recordings and different things. And I was looking at, okay, well, what were they actually doing? Rather than just sitting there listening passively, maybe taking in or absorbing information, how did I manage to flip that in terms of, you know, first of all, they were asking questions. I could have conversations with them that elaborated on learning or personally scaffolded for them. I was able to hear students reflecting. They were comparing their ideas and works to others, and they were saying things like, oh, that's a good idea, I'm going to bring that into my presentation or my sharing. Students were certainly giving each other feedback. They were supporting each other. They were working together for a shared purpose. It gave them a sense of, I guess, productivity in times where I think students could tend to err on the caution of not being on the side of not being so productive. But ultimately, all of these quality things, these quality learning processes came out of this experience. And for me, I've now seen, I guess, the potential behind coupling together these different platforms and using them so they can be really powerful and provide opportunities for the learners to work together like they normally would in my classroom, where they come in and I'll give them bits of paper and printouts and pens and posters and all sorts of things to be co-authoring and presenting and designing and all those things. And now I feel that I have been able to somewhat successfully transfer that to an online platform. And that's been something that's I feel quite accomplished with, in terms of feeling satisfied with my own teaching practice and that I can support their learning. So the things that I guess have stuck with me through this process are the fact that students actually made some comments in the end along the lines of that we're actually doing what we would normally do in a real classroom. And for me, that was very important in supporting these particular students' learning, because for us, the most important thing is not only are we teaching students to teach, we're actually always modeling to them. So we always need to make sure that they can see what we are talking about in our practice. So that's the most important thing that I guess drives my teaching philosophy, is that what I am preaching, I also need to be practicing. So I'm not sure how we're going for time, Susan. I think we're probably pretty close.
Thank you.
Yes.
You've got 2 minutes.
Wonderful. So I guess the main takeaway for me is that regardless of where the students were located, regardless of how many tens or hundreds of kilometres away they were all able to join a virtual online space and contribute to and construct a shared resource or shared ideas in the one place, and that they were actually learning and doing. So rather than sitting back passively and hopefully maybe taking bits and pieces in, they were actually doing it, not simply just, I guess, turning up and being present for a lecture. So that's what I took out of my experience over the last few months, and I thought that while not rocket science, I thought it might be something worthwhile sharing with other people to see how you might want to make these connections or innovations with some of the things that you're doing, particularly as we teach online. And that brings me to the end of my presentation, Susan.
Thank you very much, Hayley. And while it may not be rocket science, I actually think this is better than rocket science. You've shared some really great ideas, and I'm sure that there's many people in the audience today who, like you and I, like to be interactive with our students when we're face to face, and it is difficult to get that same level of interaction as well as with us. So thank you for all those fabulous ideas, and can I say a lot of really positive feedback in the chat box. I'll let you have a look at that yourself. But I'm just scanning down. There was a question about if you find that using the teams, do students use that on a social basis as well?
I have found that if you create a group where they are familiar and they know each other, then they are inclined if you put in the effort as well. If you make the connections and say, how are you progressing? Here are the resources. They engage as a learning environment, which is really great. They also use it for shared assessment purposes, but beyond that, they don't tend to use it socially unless you're supporting their learning environment. But for the students that I normally teach face-to-face, we have found these, I've taught them for 3 years, and now they're all of a sudden all by themselves at home and they have no one to ask questions to. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword where you can't get away because you're always there and online. But yeah, it's been absolutely wonderful in terms of supporting learners and keeping them connected with the learning that's going on.
Excellent. Would you be able to stop sharing your screen, please? And as another question's come through, asking what class sizes have you used this with, apart from the small group that you mentioned earlier?
So I have, I had a group of 15 and a group of 18 students that I've used this with. And now I'm actually going to start thinking about changing potentially my model for distance, where I'm actually thinking about, and this is thinking out loud before talking out loud before I've had enough time to think about it. But I actually feel, particularly with a first year group that I have, that I might change to a digital lecture recording that I embed within Moodle, then have a session that is based on breakout rooms and using Teams to actually engage and do group work, because those students who are fully distance students very, very rarely get the opportunity to even talk to fellow peers. So it's something that I'm going to look into using next year in more of a greater space.
Excellent. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I'm sure if people want to follow up with you, that they will track you down, whether within CQU or any of our other attendees from other universities.